same idea to analyze tariffs and efficiency laws. Notice how I do it here. You see this diagram, where is it here? There. With, by the way, a linear example of something. This diagram here, a linear example. Now this turns out to be very interesting. We're moving into an issue about international trade. And one of the most important things, or rather one of the most hallowed things of economics, ever since Adam Smith, competition is the best type of society, laissez-faire, no government intervention in general, right? Let people make up their own minds, let the markets operate. That's a core value in economics. But when we've talked already that it may not be sensible. There's reasons. What about if there's a natural monopoly? What about, we're going to see externalities later, what about this distribution of income issue? And when we talk about macroeconomics, we're going to see a whole other problem with the competitive market. But in general, though, for most economists, one of the mainstays, the basic idea, competitive markets are best, right? But they may not always be so. Okay, out of that also flows this idea that free trade is best. That Canada should not have barriers to trade. We should allow the cheapest goods in the world to come into our country, and we should sell our goods to anybody. We should not have barriers. Now those barriers can be various types. For example, some countries might say, if you're going to sell goods here, you have to have a certain government official receipt stamp or something. Very difficult to get, so it prevents goods coming in. But usually, what happens is there's what we call a tariff. A tariff is just a tax on foreign goods. That's it, right? So for example, right now, why we have this, I don't know, because we're supposed to have free trade with the United States, but we actually have taxes on certain goods. If you went to Buffalo and bought goods back, you wouldn't, unless up to over a certain amount, you'd have to pay tax on it. But we're supposed to have free trade with the United States, which should mean you can buy goods anywhere in the US and bring them here and pay no import duty, right? That's the idea. So, I was saying, the history of the modern world in many ways is the history of countries that had tariffs and got rid of them. Britain had tariffs on corn, on Indian cotton, various other things. By 1845, they were free traders. You could import anything into Britain, no tariff. Germany had some of the highest tariffs in the world between 1870 and 1945. Now they're basically a free trade country. The country that had the highest tariffs in the world between 1830 and 1940 was the United States. Literally the highest tariffs in the world, by a long shot. They are now one of the great free trading countries of the world. Canada had high tariffs at one time, blah, blah, blah. So countries go through this phase. But economic theory says free trade is best. So, I can remember, and this is classic, and you can see it happen when the G8, if we ran through the tapes of the G8 in Ireland, we would see that basically those guys are getting together and talking free trade. And when they met in Toronto, it was all about free trade, right? That's the biggest buzzword in economics. But you'll also remember in Toronto and in Ireland and Genoa and Seattle and various Quebec City, various places where they've had the G8. The G8 ministers get around together and they all smile and say free trade is best. And there's 10-foot barriers of steel and concrete and mesh and barbed wire and 5,000 police and army. And on the other side there's protesters. If free trade is best, why is that the case? But guess what? This is positive economics. We don't answer those questions. They must be wrong. Those people outside shrieking free trade isn't good must be wrong. George Bush, what year was it? 2003 or something. Yeah, 2003 or something. There was a huge UN conference in New York on AIDS, and George Bush was the keynote speaker. And he stood up and said, "You know what the solution to AIDS is? Free trade." Really, I'm not kidding. Free trade. So this is a buzzword in economics. Now we're going to get the buzzword explanation of this. It's not a really, there's problems with this explanation, But again, in many ways, what we're learning here is, and you begin to realize, many of the politicians and business types and business editors, like you guys, by the end of this course, you should be able to watch any business show and go, like, who was that guy who was on the Dragon's Den? What is that bald-headed guy? What a twit. No, beyond imagination. A total twit. Whatever comes out of his mouth, he'll go, oh my God, this guy's an idiot. This is lies, more lies than other lies. He probably only had the first half of the first year economics course, and he's spouting off this drivel, right? You will see it. This is what we'll see that even in first year, you'll know the basics, but you'll know a lot more than the basics. So learn it properly, right? So here we're going to learn the basic explanation. Reminds me, there was a movie, I can't remember what it was a French movie. A guy learns how to hypnotize people, like it's like a French movie, it's supposedly taking place in 1780. He goes to a doctor, he learns how to hypnotize, and then he goes around basically being a criminal, hypnotizing people. And it comes down to the trial, because he only was with the guy for like long enough to learn the basics of hypnotism. So the trial comes, and he's a smart guy, and gets getting away with everything. But what do you think happens? His teacher shows up, and all that guy has is 2 weeks of hypnotism, and the teacher just shows up and looks at him and goes, and the guy's completely hypnotized, right? Because he doesn't know sophisticated hypnotism. So he's completely hypnotized, they make him tell the truth, bang, he goes off to jail. I think he gets his head cut off, which is what he deserves. But the same idea, a lot of the world you'll discover are people who seem to remember the basic stuff without any understanding of economics, like P equals MC, that's all they know. They apply it everywhere without realizing when it doesn't work. Similar to this idea. So you're going to know it, but you're also going to think a little bit more about it, that it may not cover everything, right? Same with that idea we talked about, minimum wage laws. Okay, here we go. Okay, let us suppose this is the demand in Canada, right? So I'll just put here Canadian demand. And here is supply, i.e. marginal cost in Canada, right? Food. Supply in Canada. Supply in Canada, right? So let's suppose we're going to say, I'm going to go with dryers. I'll put it like this. Clothes dryers. Now it used to be, oh, by the way, New York Times today. Notice on the front page of the business section, a dizzying condo market in Toronto. Is it going to collapse, right? So we'll be discussing stuff like that later. But you can be, is it going to collapse? We'll see. But the reason I bring that up, it says this. Do you guys know where Liberty Village is? Do you know where Liberty Village is? Good. Because it used to, like, where the exhibition grounds are, Strawn Street, there's a 51 division of the police is there. South of King, west of Strawn, to Dufferin, used to be, not quite to Dufferin, used to be the Massey Ferguson plant. I was just telling this to the other class, which was Canada's most successful manufacturing company, really. Produced tractors, agricultural machinery for everybody on earth. It was, the tractors were amazing. John Deere sucks. These were amazing tractors, right? Everybody in the world bought this thing. Massey Hall. You know it? Massey, Hart House. He died in World War I and they built Hart House in his memory. The building across from the museum, just across Avenue Road, is called the Lillian Massey Building. You look up and it says Household Science. There's a Club Monaco in there, Massey. Let me think of another one. Massey College, U of T, right? Massey. Huge, successful corporation, philanthropist, blah, 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 blah. Well, they owned all that land, and then along came the spider in the name of Conrad Black. And he bought up Massey Ferguson, and he just sucked it dry. took the pension funds, took all the money. That was Mr. Massey Ferguson. He took off with a fortune, left nothing behind. 30 years ago, they bulldozed the whole place. It was literally empty. But also there, at the same place, there's another manufacturer called Inglis, which used to make stoves in Toronto. No, all sorts of stuff like washing machines, dryers, blah, 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 blah. Inglis, right? Okay, anyway, the reason I said that is Liberty Village, it was empty. 20 years ago, it got filled in with kind of neat little houses. It has a kind of place near Dufferin and King where there's, you know, some restaurants, kind of cool, old factories, blah, blah, blah. Empty otherwise. In the last 10 years, it's become a wall of condos. Go in there, it's like, oh my God. It's like, terrible, terrible. Anyway, this is what it's talking about. Sandwiched between two rail lines in this city's core, great factories once produced the finest Canada could offer the world. Magic baking powder, Brunswick bowling alley flooring, and Massey Ferguson farm equipment. These have all been abandoned or demolished. But the area is bustling. It's now called Liberty Village and is packed with high-rise condominiums largely built over the last 5 years. It turns out 55,000 new condo units are being built in Toronto this year. As we talked about before, Toronto has built more condos in the last 5 years than New York, Chicago, LA, altogether, easily, right? So, that's an interesting economic thing, we'll get to that. But this Inglis, it existed 30 years ago, before the free trade agreement with the United States. And basically, here's our deal. Suppose these factories producing clothes dryers in Canada, we didn't get clothes dryers at all from the US. No dryers from the US. This is the Canadian price. This is the quantity sold in Canada. If we had no international trade, everybody? And let us say that such a clothes dryer sold for in Canada, I'll say $700, which it might have, right? Now, it turns out we didn't have anybody selling any US clothes dryers because we had a tariff. It turned out at the time, in the US, there was this price because they have a much bigger market, economies of scale, blah, blah, blah. You would have this. The price in the US for a clothes for a dryer was $500, imported say. I could bring it in from Buffalo or Chicago or wherever for $500 to my house in Toronto, or buy a Canadian one for $700. Now you'd say, well, why wouldn't I buy the US one? Because every US one you brought in, you had to pay a tariff of $200, right, everybody? Or maybe even $300. So nobody would buy in the US because it cost you $700 to bring it in from the US, $500 from the US manufacturer, and $200 as a tax. Okay? Now our question is this: should we get rid of that tax and allow free importation of dryers from the US or not? Now on the one side are consumers who say, hey, wait a minute, we love this. We'll get cheaper dryers. Our consumer surplus will go up. Of course they don't talk about that, but we'll get cheaper dryers. Good. But on the other hand, the manufacturers, no. If these dryers come in, we're going to produce fewer dryers. We're going to have less profits. So, we're going to have Canadian output is smaller. Okay, how do we decide on this? How do we decide? It turns out what we do is we look at the net efficiency loss to society. That is the difference between the producer surplus gain or loss and the consumer surplus gain or loss. So we're going to look at, should we have free trade? Well, free trade would mean, for consumers, the price would fall from $700 this, and we would have this quantity demanded in Canada. So there'd be more stoves or clothes or dryers sold in Canada. The quantity demanded goes up, lower price. But unfortunately, you would also have fewer dryers dryers produced in Canada, price equals marginal cost. This would be the quantity supplied in Canada. If you had free trade, what would constitute the difference? Would be this amount right here. This would be imports, right? We have imports right here. All right? These are the imports. Should we have imports? We're going to eliminate the tariff and we're going to have free trade. So this is a big debate in Canada, 1988 free trade agreement. Okay, let's see now. How are we going to measure the loss to producers? Producers flat out lose and consumers gain. We've got to figure out what is the net gain to society. Well, the producers used to get this. This was their producer surplus, right? What kind of thing is that? All right. This is the producer surplus, less than the price in Canada, greater than the marginal cost. This is the operating profit. Everybody produces surplus? All right. Now, if we were to lower the price to this, this is the producer surplus in Canada. Right? So we measure the loss here as the change in producer surplus. So absolutely, it's going to cost this loss in profit in Canada for these firms. There it is. Producer surplus loss. Right there. All right. What about consumer surplus? All right. What about consumer surplus? Let's check this out. This would be, there would be the original consumer surplus for Canadian consumers. This will be the new consumer surplus for Canadian consumers. And this will be the gain in consumer surplus, like that. All right, there's the gain in consumer surplus. Now then, what do you think? Should we have free trade or tariffs?
Free trade.
All right, just give me 2 seconds. Why? Tell me why we should have free trade. Why is free trade better for the society? Producers lose, consumers gain. Why is free trade better for society? Yeah, go ahead.
I think because the gain in consumer surplus is larger than the loss in producer surplus.
Right. And so we can actually look at that and say, this is the net consumer surplus gain to society. It is that. We can measure it. You're looking at it. The blue bit that's showing there. That is the efficiency gain. Everybody? Hence, free trade and imports is good. Now you'll notice, by the way, bring your minds to receive mode, because this leads us into macro. I did a study in like 1988 in the free trade agreement, which I kind of disagreed with. It turns out maybe I was right, maybe I was wrong, doesn't matter. But it's not worth going into. But looked at a lot of studies. There must have been like 100 studies at the time. And you should know this. You might say to yourself, why are we measuring the cost to the loss to producers only by the producer surplus loss? What about the people who lose their jobs? We're not even talking about them, right? What about the factories that close down? We're not talking about them, right? There'd be some factories that close down, actually there were. And there'd be some people who lose their jobs. There were. We don't include them in the analysis. Why? It turns out all the studies that looked at this said, and this is a standard economic thing, we don't have to worry about that. Now this is going to feed into macro, because modern economics claims that market economies have the property of there never being unemployment, because the market always moves to where quantity demand equals quantity supply. So basically, nobody loses a job. If you lose a job in a factory producing dryers, you'll just move to another job. Nice. And if there's capital that's a factory that closes down, no problem. They'll produce something else. That is a fundamental part of this. And we'll discuss that. Is that a reasonable position to assume that there is no such thing as unemployment? That's the central idea of macroeconomics. And we'll talk about that. So in short, there is an issue here. This might not be the full measure. But it also gives us an idea, like, we might say, well, that's the efficiency loss, but what if we lose this amount of jobs, and those people lose more income than that, maybe we want to deal with that, right? But we can measure it, that's the main thing. Okay, now, one other thing here. I'm going to dish all this wrong with you. I hope you people know who Pierre Elliott Trudeau was, because his son is not back with us. This was called the National Policy. Okay, we're going to be talking here about oil. This is still relevant today, really. But here's the deal. Oil, I forget when it was 1984 or something. I'm not sure what it was. I might have in my notes it was 1975. I don't think it was. Anyway, this is the demand for oil and the supply of oil in Canada. So let's do it. Supply in Canada, and this is demand in Canada, right? Supposing we did not sell oil to anybody else in the world. Now, Canada produces a lot of oil. So we would end up then with the equilibrium price in Canada would be, and it was, by the way, in that time, this is the Canadian price, was something like $20. You could sell oil for about $20 because that's only the demand in Canada. Okay, well, it turned out in the 1970s the price of oil went to $40 a barrel. The international price was $40 a barrel. So the US price in particular, because that's who we sold it with, was $40 a barrel. Okay? So, Trudeau had this issue. Let's think about this for a moment. And this is 30-some years ago. At that time, Alberta probably had 2 million population, maybe not that much, 1.5 million. And Ontario had a population at least 6 or 7 million, right? So we had like 4 to 5 times the size of population of Alberta. So here's the deal. If we have Alberta selling all their oil at the international price, Ontario has to buy oil at the international price. So what's better for the country? 6 million people in Ontario spending more for heating and gasoline, or 1.5 million people in Alberta getting a higher price of oil. Which is better? What do you think? Trudeau and the Liberals decided that, oh, this is a no-brainer. Better that Ontario should get cheap oil than a few people in Alberta should get a high price of oil. That's what he argued. So the national energy policy, basically forced Alberta to sell oil to Ontario cheaper than the international price because the federal government controls exports constitutionally. Anyway, this is one of the biggest divisive things in Canada for the West. I was just in BC. I saw one of my sisters, who's basically a crackpot anyway, but she's from Alberta. She basically lived in Alberta for a while, and she lost a house, which she blames on the national energy policy. She's still crying, but I couldn't believe it. There I was 2 days or 4 days ago, whatever, standing there enjoying myself, and I'm getting bitched at about the national energy policy. Oh, come on, enough already, it's over, right? But basically, as I say, you guys should learn to live. Go to Calgary and say, I love the national energy policy. Do it in a bar. See how long it lasts. It won't be long. They will be seriously pissed. But anyway, no matter. Was Trudeau right or Trudeau wrong? You tell me, according to our theory. Well, work it out. How are you going to work it out, people? You're going to find the net efficiency loss. How are you going to do that? You're going to find the producer surplus gain or loss, consumer surplus. So let's cut to the chase. I expect you to know this stuff. Right? So it turns out here, or rather here, is the price. Right? This would be the quantity supplied by Alberta at that price. They produce all that oil at $40 and sell it to the US. And in Canada, we would have this number, people paying $40. And so, I'll make it, it's a little bit, I'm exaggerating too much. Maybe not. I'll just bring it down a little bit. All right. There's the quantity demanded. Difference between the two is what? Exports, right? So here we have, this is exports. Consumer surplus loss, oh, it's, if we allow Alberta to do this, the consumer surplus loss is going to be significant. Here it is. This is the loss to consumers. I'm just doing a comparison. However, here is the producer surplus gain. Right, everybody? I'm just hang on. That's not, I'm just being careless. It's here. What does that thing do now? There it is. Forget that line for exports, it's confusing. All right, what's the answer? Was Trudeau correct according to the theory? Yes or no?
Yes.
Yes. Yes? I was basically your age when Trudeau was elected, that first election. Maybe a little bit, but basically the same age. And I was working on a pipeline in Saskatchewan with a bunch of men, and we were like the wilds of Saskatchewan, doing nothing, in bars, carrying on, stuff like that. And the campaign was on. And it was amazing because these guys are deeply conservative. They hated most of central Canada. But weirdly, for that one Trudeau mania, they all loved him. Everybody loved Trudeau. It was a lot of fun. Everybody was into Trudeau. He was the greatest, right? And he still, but within a few years, the West hated him. But was he right or was he wrong? Come on, people, this is Trudeau. Wake up. Your world is Harper. That's sad for you. I was listening to Jimi Hendrix and Led Zeppelin. You guys are listening to rap. That's sad. Don't let it happen to you. Take control of your life. Right? Think of greatness. It's not Harper and it's not rap. This is the news, right? Although Harper's pretty impressive in his own negative way. Trudeau, was he right or wrong? Come on, wake up. I need to know. He was wrong, right? According to this, he was wrong. That's all we need to know. And this is the basic idea. These two diagrams are at the core of all those people who say free trade is the best. These two diagrams. It's a lot more sophisticated than that. But that's it. That's what most of them have. Okay, now, next. All right. I thought you people would enjoy this stuff because it's more practical. We're just using this and going. Okay, here it is. Next. Externalities. In particular, cost externalities. I'm going to do about 10 minutes of this, and then we're going to take a break. Then we're going to start comparative advantage. Okay. This is, I'm going to use as an example, I could use anything. I'll use cigarettes. And this is the supply of cigarettes. The supply of cigarettes equal to N times marginal cost, the sum of marginal cost, if you want. The sum of MC, like that, okay? This is the demand in Canada, or anyway, it doesn't matter. This is the market equilibrium right here. This is the price of a cigarette in Canada right now. Or let's say, it's 50 30 years ago will say, here's the price of a cigarette, $5 a pack.